for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GBNews Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with Mercy Muroki and Inaya Falarin Iman. We're on your TV, radio and online.
We're with you until midday, talking you through today's top stories with our expert guests. We want to hear your views as well as ours.
Yes, and you can get them in on our usual email, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll try and get to as many as we can throughout the programme. But first, let's give you your latest headlines with Rosie.
Well, a very good morning. 1 minute past 10. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank is now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk and say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. The Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng will appear in the Commons today and face questions from MPs about his economic plans. The Labour Party are calling for Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to reverse more of their decisions made on the mini-budget. The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, told GB News the government's strategy is wrong.
What the government's going to do now is announce a whole series of public spending cuts in this Halloween fiscal event at the end of the month. And, you know, this doesn't make sense to make one set of mistakes and then compound it by making the public pay for ministers' mistakes through cuts in public services. It'd be far better to pause this whole thing and revisit the mistakes that caused the market chaos in the first place.
The Prime Minister is going to urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in support of Ukraine during crisis talks later. Liz Truss and her Ukrainian counterpart will join the virtual meeting of world leaders. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital, amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces. Well, that's despite Moscow launching its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the UK's ambassador to the UN, Dame Barbara Woodward, last night repeated her calls for Russia to end the war.
Putin is trying to take Ukraine's land, its resources, its identity. In doing so, he is overturning the most sacred principle in the international system, that borders cannot be drawn by force.
Supreme Court judges are going to begin hearing arguments today to determine if the Scottish Parliament can hold an independence referendum without the support of Westminster. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon declared she'd like to hold the vote in October next year. 2 days have been set aside at the Supreme Court for the hearing, with the UK government expected to respond tomorrow. Well, the last vote for independence was held in 2014, and 55% of the Scottish electorate rejected independence. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the ONS said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. There's also been a record rise in the number of people off work or not looking for work because of long-term sickness. The first of the funerals for the victims of the service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland are taking place today. Candlelit vigils have been held in Ireland to remember the victims of what's a suspected gas explosion which killed 10 people on Friday. Police do believe the blast was an accident and they're investigating the cause. Heathrow has regained its status as Europe's busiest airport despite struggling with staff shortages and imposing a daily passenger cap over the summer. The airport claims it had a higher volume of travellers between July and September of this year than any other of Europe's busy terminals, like those in Paris and Amsterdam. However, demand at Heathrow last month was still 15% lower than before the pandemic. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it develops. Now let's head back to the point.
Good morning, it's 10:06 and this is To The Point on GB News with me, Mercy Muroki, and Inaya Falarin Iman on your TV, radio and online. We're here with you until midday. Here's what's coming up.
Yes, well, could Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon get her wish of a second Scottish referendum without the consent of Westminster? The Supreme Court will today hear arguments in favour of this. We'll be looking at her chances of winning.
And freedom protests are continuing in Iran as citizens oppose religious authoritarianism in the country, while the British government has now imposed sanctions on Iran's morality police and leading political figures over serious human rights violations. We'll be speaking to the director of an Iranian human rights campaign over recent unrest.
And Tina Brown, author of The Palace Papers, has said she thinks Prince Harry's book ever see the light of day. Although his new memories are set to be released later this year, there is some speculation that they could be pulled. We'll be speaking to a royal biographer later in the show to find out more details.
That's all coming up and much more as well across the programme. And get in touch with your views. As usual, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We will read them throughout the programme.
Yesterday, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, closed the annual SNP conference, telling delegates that it was the will of the country to vote again on the question of independence. However, for that vote to take place, Westminster has to grant Sturgeon's government the authority to do so, something that they have said they're not willing to do. So today, the Supreme Court will take on the case and will decide in the coming weeks if the Scottish Government can hold a second independence referendum without permission from Westminster. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, sent us this report.
In Scotland, the battle for the future of Britain has not gone away. After success in last year's Holyrood elections, the SNP argued they're determined not to give up on the hope of independence.
Whether it's Tory or Labour, Labour or Tory, it's not us who gets to decide. Our votes don't determine who gets to occupy number 10. For Scotland, the problem is not just which party is in power at Westminster, the problem is Westminster.
But ultimately, the decision for a second referendum is currently not theirs to take. That's why the battle is moving to London and to hear the UK's Supreme Court, who will decide if MPs at Westminster or MSPs in Edinburgh should have the final say on another vote.
But what if the decision doesn't go their way? Well, that leaves Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP with two big problems. First of all, what do they do next, particularly when the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, has made it clear that she thinks there shouldn't be another vote anytime soon? And second of all, while the polls are pretty divided on independence, evenly split, only a third of Scots think that now is the right time for another referendum.
A lot of people expect the Supreme Court to rule against that, and if that's the case, she said that she'll try to turn the next general election into a de facto referendum. Whether she can actually do that, I mean, who can, after all, decide what is the issues of an election campaign? So there's doubts over whether it actually will be a de facto referendum. But I think what Nicola Sturgeon is maybe trying to do on that as well is to retain relevance, to try to ensure that her supporters don't vote for Labour instead. So by raising the issue of independence, she might be able to hold on to those pro-independence votes.
But for most SNP activists, Nicola Sturgeon must not relent.
We will use the Westminster election, the next Westminster election. If the Supreme Court says no, that will be used as a plebiscite referendum. We have that right under international law.
Are you frustrated, though?
With the UK government, absolutely. As she said at the weekend, if they are so confident, why not just let it go ahead?
What should she do next? What do you want to see her do next?
Well, she said she's going to use it for the next general election.
Do you think that's going to work, though?
I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. But I hope so. But let's hope. Let's wait and see what the Supreme Court says. Then we'll make a judgment, I think.
For the moment, focus will now be on the Supreme Court's hearing. With a judgment due to take months, this drawn-out battle is not likely to conclude anytime soon, to the frustration of nearly everyone on every side of the debate. Darren McCaffrey, GB News, Aberdeen.
Well, our national reporter Paul Hawkins was outside the Supreme Court in London and sent us this report.
Today at the Supreme Court, we will hear from Scotland's top legal officer, from the Scottish Government's top legal officer, Deborah Bain, who will argue that holding an independence referendum would be advisory. It would be like the 2016 Brexit referendum in the sense that it is advisory, it's not legally binding, and that after a referendum you would still need legislation and negotiation to separate Scotland from the UK in the same way that the UK was separated from the European Union. So that will be the thrust of her argument that she will make to 5 Supreme Court judges today. Tomorrow we will hear from the UK government's side. They will argue that, first of all, the judges don't even need to really consider this case, because even if they did say, yes, you can hold an independence referendum, that even as the bill, and here it is, a Scottish independence referendum bill, all 5 pages of it, even as it passes through the Scottish Parliament, the MSPs could change the wording of the bill, rendering this judgment redundant. So first of all, they'll argue that, and then the main thrust of their argument will be, put simply, that Westminster holds the power when it comes to deciding whether Scotland can hold a referendum or not. So this hearing will last 2 days, and a judgment will come down in a matter of weeks or months. The weight of legal opinion suggests that it is a possibility the Scottish Government could win their case, and if they would, it would be huge. But the probability is that the UK Government will win their case, and in that case, as Nicola Sturgeon has said, then the next general election becomes a one-issue election on the issue of Scottish independence.
Well, joining us now to discuss this in more detail is Ian McWhirter, political commentator and author of Disunited Kingdom, How Westminster Won a Referendum but Lost Scotland. Thank you for joining us this morning. I do want you to clarify something for us, because as far as I understood, the law was quite clear in that Scotland would need the Scottish Parliament would need Westminster's approval to be able to hold a referendum. Is this suggesting now that actually it's more of a grey area?
Well, it's not so much a grey area as constitutional theatre. I don't think anybody in the Scottish National Party seriously believes that the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is going to authorise a referendum which would break up the United Kingdom, when, as the Supreme Court has said repeatedly throughout Brexit, that Westminster has to have the whip hand on all matters of the Constitution. So any referendum has to be decided by Westminster, and there's not a snowball's chance in hell of Westminster agreeing to a referendum, no matter who is in power, at least not for the time being. So I don't think, they'll come out with the legal arguments today. You can go into these in obsessive detail. In fact, it's quite amusing that the Dorothy Bain, the Lord Advocate, who herself is very dubious about whether or not the Scottish Parliament had a right to put this bill in the first place, she was very sceptical. She is now arguing, it's not a real referendum they're having, it's an advisory referendum. It doesn't mean anything at all. It has no bearing in the Constitution. That's what she's going to argue today. And apparently using as a precedent the Brexit referendum, saying, well, that was only advisory. Parliament had to decide that in the end. But, this is pure sophistry, because everybody knows that if you hold a national plebiscite, like the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, if you hold that, it is only advisory. Westminster has to authorise any such vote. And as I say, there's no chance of that happening. So it's constitutional theatre.
And on that that point about theatre, though, I mean, is that not part of Nicola Sturgeon's strategy, so to speak, to kind of drag this out in order to paint Westminster as preventing the will of the Scottish people? So even if she knows that this may not go her favour, this particular case, she's using it to drum up more support for independence.
Well, yeah, I mean, she's in a bind because, I mean, the SNP dominates politics at every level in Scotland in an extraordinary degree, even though it's been in power for 14 years. And even though in many areas of policy, the health, education, and what have you, their performance has been pretty poor. And there's maybe one reason why she didn't mention education at all in her speech yesterday. But, you know, they have more MPs than all the unionist parties put together, many times more MSPs in the Scottish Parliament than all the unionist parties put together. And they were even piling up even more votes, advancing their share of the vote, even increased in the last local government elections. So, you know, they are utterly in control politically. But Nicola Sturgeon has been unable in the last 8 years to move the dial on independence. And a lot of her troops are extremely frustrated. They say, well, look, the Party of Independence keeps getting voted for, but nothing seems to happen about it. So she's been forced to come up with some kind of holding operation which gives people something to focus on while there's no prospect of this referendum, which there isn't.
And by your estimation, what is the mood in Scotland in terms of independence? Because I'm just looking at a view here from one of our viewers saying Nicola Sturgeon has no actual evidence that independence is the will of the people. Let me assure you, we are not keen on independence, and I have friends who are considering moving to England if there's a vote for separation. We don't often see that side of things. Is that a sentiment that is shared widely across Scotland, do you think?
Yeah, well, the opinion polls indicate, and have done really for the last 8 years, that Scotland is absolutely divided down the middle on independence. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote for independence, because the argument hasn't really been broached yet. Everything's been done in terms of theory. If you listen to what Nicola Sturgeon was saying yesterday, she was saying, well, there's lots of small nations in Europe, they do very well, like Denmark and Norway. Why can't we do the same thing? Which is fair enough. It's a fair enough point. However, if you look at the practicalities of separation, now that Britain is out of the European Union, if Scotland votes for independence, Scotland will be out of the UK, which is its largest trading partner. It'll be out of the EU as well. It won't have a currency. Indeed, the SNP is extremely divided in its own party about what should happen after independence, whether you should have a new currency immediately or whether you should have a currency that pegs the pound. Now, if you imagine what would happen if there really was a referendum on the 23rd of September next year, in the midst of a cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, the war in Europe, and Scotland decides to put a hard border with the rest of the UK and go it alone with a massive public sector deficit and no currency. I mean, talk about fiscal events. I mean, this would be a fiscal apocalypse. So people have not had the chance to look at the practicalities and the mechanisms for becoming independent in this very new situation, which is that, as I say, Britain is out of the European Union.
Yeah,
in 2014, the presumption was that both would be remaining in the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, I take the practicalities point, and interestingly enough, I was in Glasgow over the weekend, and many people, even in Glasgow, which is often seen as a very pro-independence area, were just kind of exhausted by the debate and worried about the division it would cause. But even if, you make the point about timing, this question is unlikely to really ever go away, because as you mentioned, SNP dominates Scottish politics. That question of independence and sovereignty is a reoccurring theme within Scottish politics. So in that sense, is it not, if the referendum is not held in the next year or so, it will be held again at some point, and these questions will be come to the fore of the public debate again?
Well, they probably will, and I think what will happen, I mean, the Supreme Court, they might say that the Scottish Parliament has the power to hold some kind of opinion poll, but they're not going to authorise a full-scale referendum. So what's going to happen is that Nicola Sturgeon says the 2024 general election will be turned into a de facto referendum on independence, a plebiscite on independence. Now, I'm not even sure that she fully thought this through before she adopted this policy. but a number of people in the party have, and they've said, well, you know, this is a very big ask, because she set the bar very high. She says, if there's more than 50% of Scots vote in that general election for the SNP, that will itself be a mandate to begin negotiations, to open negotiations the next day with Westminster about leaving the UK.
Ian, thank you so much for... We will have to leave it there, but you've been great. Thank you, Ian McWhirter, a political commentator and author of Disunited Kingdom.
Well, very interesting subject. I mean, as the question, as I was mentioning, even if it's not held in the next year or two, it is a question that seems to perpetually dominate Scottish politics. And I do think those in Westminster who support the union need to make a much more meaningful, profound case for the union, not just one of practicalities and economics. Yeah,
I think you're right. And, you know, also, I don't think the question will go away as long as Nicola Sturgeon remains First Minister of Scotland. And as we mentioned there, she does have the most seats, more than the Unionist parties combined by far. So there you go. Well, after the break, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has announced sanctions on the so-called morality police in Iran and senior security officials as well. Well, what impact, if any, will this have on the regime in Iran and on protests there? That's what we'll be discussing after the break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning, it's 10:23 and this is To The Point with Inaya Falari Iman and myself, Mercy Muroki on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio.
Well, the UK has imposed sanctions on Iran's morality police and other senior security officials. This comes as widespread protests sweep the country following the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who had been arrested by morality police for allegedly not adhering to Iran's strict Islamic dress code.
Yes, well, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has now said this, quote, "The UK stands with the people of Iran who are bravely calling for accountability from their government and for their fundamental human right to be respected. These sanctions send a clear message to the Iranian authorities. We will hold you to account for your oppression of women and girls and for the shocking violence you have inflicted on your people."
And Iranian officials continue to insist that Ms. Amini was not mistreated. Will the UK sanctions make any difference to the success of the protests, and how seriously are the Ayatollahs threatened by the protests? Well, joining us now to discuss this is Mahmoud Amiri Moghadin, Director of the NGO Iran Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. I mean, question, do you think that the UK government, for example, has been slow to act? I mean, these protests has been going on for a few weeks now, and several people have died in clashes between the forces in Iran, and it seems that this is a relatively minor measure and one that comes quite late. What do you think?
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. So I think any measure is better than no measure. Unfortunately, the situation of human rights in Iran has not been the main focus of the international community, and especially the Western countries, in the past few years. And what we see now is a nationwide protest where Iranian people, men and women, girls and boys, coming out calling for their fundamental rights. So the fact that the UK state that they stand by Iranian people, I think it's important. And but we need also more concrete action. I think that putting the morality police on the sanction list is fine, but I think the international community should go beyond that. I agree with the Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister, saying that Iranian leaders must be held accountable.
Yeah.
But what mechanisms do we have to hold them accountable?
On that, can I just ask you specifically on that? In your view, what kind of measures should be used then? Because the government, do have a limited number of things they can do when it comes to getting involved in the affairs of another country. But within what they can do, what would you call for?
Yeah, so beside the sanctions against specific people, like I would say all Iranian leadership, the Revolutionary Guards, and all security forces, and not only morality police, that's one thing. The other thing is to establish a mechanism supervised by United Nations to investigate and hold accountable those who have been responsible for shooting at the people. So we had the same measure in Syria. It's called IIIM, Independent, Impartial, International Mechanism. And I think the same can be done for Iran. It's a prosecution mechanism supervised by the United Nations, and UK can push for such a mechanism. I think that would be a major step, and of course continuing supporting Iranian people's demands. Supporting for fundamental rights, free elections. We have done that before, in South Africa when we had apartheid. The international community played a very important role in forcing the apartheid regime to back off, and I think the same they can do with Iran.
And I mean, because obviously it was sparked by this tragic death of this young woman, but it has broadened out to be much more than that, seemingly. Questions about the wider government, the rule in general. I mean, do you think that this could really escalate into something more significant? Because what has often happened, particularly in that region, that you'll have these protests and there'll be crackdowns, and sometimes they die out because there's a lack of leadership and so on. I mean, do you think this has the potential to become much more?
Absolutely, as you clearly state. So the brutal murder of Mahsa Amini was just the last drop that led to an overflow. So Iranians are out now. They have had enough of a suppressive, highly incompetent and corrupt regime that has taken away their most basic rights for more than 40 years. What we see, the difference between this time and the previous protests is that people are very angry. I haven't seen them so angry in so many years. Iran Human Rights, which I lead, has been monitoring situation in Iran for more than 15 years. And they are more determined. Last time we had nationwide protests in November 2019. Iranian authorities shut down the internet, started shooting at the people, and the protests ended after 6 days. Now Iranian authorities started the same way, shutting down internet, still is shut down in many areas, shooting at the people. But we are in the 4th week of the protests. In my view, there is no way back. So these protests have the potential of a major change. which will have an impact beyond Iran's borders, because there are millions of women who are suppressed, who don't have the same rights as men, either according to the law or according to the traditions. And right now, Iranian women and men are out for equal rights. And I think what the international community can do is to limit the human casualties. But these people have come to make a significant change, and I think that's the way it's going.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Mahmoud Amiri Morghadin, Director of the NGO Iran Human Rights. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, now we're just going to go to a couple of your views. Lots of you have been getting in touch about Scotland, which seems to be hot on the agenda today for many of you. Teresa says, I'm English, living in Scotland. I hate this. It's very unsettling. Once in a lifetime vote should mean once. So if she doesn't get her way in a second vote, would she then go for a third, then a fourth? I think Nicola Sturgeon would probably say, well, yes, it was styled as a once-in-a-generation vote, but then she would say that the circumstances have materially changed, then we've left the EU since that 2014 vote, and therefore she would argue there are grounds for another vote.
You know, I think that she'll always find an excuse for another vote. And at the end of the day, when Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom, that means that we make decisions, including Brexit, as a whole of the United Kingdom. And that was part of the deal. I mean, Anthony on Twitter said, I'm Scottish and I don't want independence. And he's basically just expressing frustration with a lot of SNP supporters who believes are obsessed with this issue. I mean, that is the worry, that we have something called a never-endum, where this issue never gets resolved and it completely occupies the whole of Scottish politics. One was rightfully mentioned by our guest that we have a cost of living crisis. Glasgow has a huge addiction problem. And this issue is still the top.
Yeah, she doesn't seem to get blamed very much for the issues that are going in Scotland. She does keep winning elections. But anyway, keep your views coming in on gbviews at gbnews.uk. And after the break, an investigation into the Royal College of Nursing has revealed serious misconduct and bullying. They've issued an apology and vowed to keep standards high. But is the damage already done? Well, we'll be speaking to a former nurse and barrister after this morning's headlines.
Very good morning, 10:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank's now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk and say they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. Well, the Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors that he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng's going to appear in the Commons today to face questions from MPs about his economic plans. The Prime Minister, Liz Truss, will urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in their support of Ukraine during crisis talks later. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces despite recent attacks. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. Supreme Court judges will begin hearing arguments today to determine if the Scottish Parliament can hold an independence referendum without the support of Westminster. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing, with the UK government expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. The ONS said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. We're on your TV, we're online and on your DAB+ radio. It's GB News. Well, let's have a quick look at the markets today. The pound will buy you $1.1070 and €1.1392 euros. The price of gold is £1,505.25 per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is at 6,877 points.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
It's 10:37 in the morning. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Anaya Falarin Iman and Mercy Muroki. We're live on your TV, online and radio.
Yes, and now the General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing has been forced to apologise after a damning internal report into the RCN leaked to the Guardian newspaper exposed bullying and misogyny and a culture where women were put at, quote, alcohol and power-related exploitation.
Well, the 77-page report by Bruce Carr KC also said the college was, quote, riddled with division, dysfunction and distrust. The college was vowed to, quote, give members the strong, professional and genuinely representative organisation they deserve.
Yes, well, the college have also claimed that safeguarding measures and protocols have been introduced and pledged to leave no stone unturned. Well, how damning is this report? How damaging is it for the Royal College of Nursing and what impact will it have? Well, here to discuss just that is Rebecca Butler, a former nurse and now a barrister. Thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate your time. I'm assuming you've read some of the details of this and the accusations levelled against the Royal College of Nursing. What's your response to that?
Good morning, Anaya and Mercy. Well, you know, it's really interesting because the Royal College of Nursing was always a highly respected representative body. They represent our
Have lost Rebecca there. We'll try and get her back in just a moment. In the meantime, have we got her back? And yes, we have. Sorry, Rebecca, you disappeared for a second. Can carry on what you were saying.
You know, it's really sad to see such a respected organisation fall in this way. Now, the RCN has always been extremely well respected and was, you know, a representative body for 500,000 or so nurses. And this report actually puts into context for me why the RCN has become militant and has become vocal on nurses' pay is because their house has been burning behind the scenes. I did a little bit of research on this point, and since before 2019, the RCN has had a crisis in its leadership. this report doesn't go to the behaviour of nurses. This report really goes to the top 15 people in the organisation. Interestingly, despite the fact that so many nurses are of an ethnic minority, they have one person representing them on the council. 90% of nurses are female, yet over 60% of the council are male. So what this report really tells us is that there is a toxic, essentially male environment at the top of the RCN, with a lot of sexual impropriety at Congress, which is their annual meeting, and appalling levels of behaviour that are redolent of what happened at the UN and what we found out about the UN behaviour about 4 years ago. So it does put into context their increased stridency, their militancy. They are now striving for relevance amongst their members, given this appalling behaviour at the top of their ranks.
And that report did say that it's the senior leadership which has, quote, been riddled with division, dysfunction and distrust, and did condemn the male-dominated governing body as well. I just wondered if it is the top that's so corrupt, and if it is a sort of a culture here, can it change, really? Doesn't it have to sort of be root and branch reform to address these issues, these deep-seated issues that this report has pointed out?
Well, absolutely. But who's going to do it? Because all of the leaders have secured their position. This is the leadership of the RCN. These things don't happen overnight. These are endemic problems within the organisation. And how on earth do you clear this all out? I mean, it sounds great, doesn't it? But as I said, this is comparable to what happened at the UN, and they haven't managed to sort their problems out in 5 years. You see, the RCN was a contributor to the pay review body that reported earlier this year. The government granted the pay review body, and the RCN must have known that this report was going to come out very much against them. So they've gone and balloted nurses for the first time ever. The RCN has balloted nurses for strike action to go for a 15% pay rise when they were only asking for just over 5% earlier in the year. So, you know, it's staggering, really, how they have deflected from what is going on internally. And I think they have let nurses down in the public eye by going on strike or balloting for strike, having only just been rewarded a very, very generous pay increase. I think they have really shot themselves in the foot, and they could lose their membership over this. It's not a mandatory body. It's not a certification body. It's not a registration body. That's the Nursing and Midwifery Council. It has always been a soft trade union, and I think they're in a lot of trouble.
And just finally, I mean, why do you think there is such a disconnect then between, you know, the culture within nursing itself? You know, many people know that nurses work very hard and very long hours and do such an important job, and this particular body that, you know, from this report is being revealed to be dysfunctional, exploitative, and power hungry in many ways.
I would suggest that many of the people on the council don't actually look after patients, which, given the nature of this report, I think the general public would be quite relieved to know that their patient contact is very minimal. You know, this atmosphere does not exist in nursing. It absolutely does not exist. This is only a group of 15 to 20 people, and it is people who have put themselves forward to leadership rather than actually being leaders in hospitals and nursing groups closer to the ground. They have pushed themselves into better paid positions within the RCN and absolutely not representative of nursing. The very fact that they cannot fully represent the diversity of nursing, we know how many migrant nurses there are in the UK who do a fantastic job for our patients. How can they have no representation on the senior board of the RCN? It's an utter disgrace.
Well, Rebecca Butler, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us about that really important story. Rebecca Butler there, who's a former nurse herself and is now a barrister.
Yeah, really frustrating to hear some of the statements that are really being levelled. And it does seem that in a lot of these organisations, like unions, this is, she rightfully mentioned the UN, and this is an issue that you do often find at these very intense bodies that represent huge swathes of people. They're often disconnected to the people that they're meant to serve.
Yeah, and I think in a way that's a symptom of lots of organisations and institutions, that the top becomes quite disconnected from the rest of the organisation. We see the same with politics, many would say. But now onto a different story, a royal story. Prince Harry, reportedly anyway, could be reconsidering his tell-all book, with the Duke of Sussex facing the prospect of his family turning on him.
Well, currently the book is still set to be released in late 2022, although this is still subject to change following the death of Queen Elizabeth II.
Yes, well, could Prince Harry's book actually get pulled, or is that wishful thinking? Would publishers easily discard what could be a highly profitable book, because it will definitely sell millions of copies, that's for sure, across the world? Well, joining us to talk about this in more detail is Angela Levin, royal commentator and biographer. Angela, thank you for joining us. This is Tina Brown who's made this statement. She's the author of the Palace Papers. She thinks that actually he will be kind of forced to reconsider either publishing at all or publishing later on.
Yes, she also said that he would ask King Charles, his father, to pay the £18 million and then he wouldn't lose the money. I doubt that, actually, but in any case, it's a very difficult situation for him, but not actually if you look at it from the outside, because if he felt it was OK when the Queen was still alive to actually be very unpleasant about the senior royals, it doesn't make a huge difference if he's actually taking it out now she's dead. I mean, the logic there is a strange one, but I think it's very difficult for him, because I think Meghan will actually want that book out because she knows he wants to talk about his life as he sees it. But on the other hand, I mean, if he attacks King Charles and Prince Andrew at this time, which is so soon after the Queen's passing, it's not going to go down well, not only with the royal family, but actually with millions of people who have warmed to King Charles, who were cheering and singing "God Save the King" when he came back to Buckingham Palace after the Queen had died. So there is a warmth there. And you don't want to throw something into something warm and turn it into cold water.
I mean, on the one hand, there's the argument that it's, tone deaf following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, but perhaps it's him trying to strike a more reconciliatory tone. Is that possible by pulling the book as well?
Yes, but I think about the money. I mean, they need the money. I mean, I was reading that they're considered to be quite poor with only 20 million. Because
that's
area
measly money, isn't it? Measly.
Is 22 billion. It's just an extraordinary area, which is extremely rich. So I don't know how else they're going to earn money if they have that. And they also got the problem with Netflix about their own lives as well. So
how much money was this book expected to bring in? Did you say 18 million was the book deal?
No, I mean, I think it's 34 million,
wow, okay.
But it was 18 million advance. Money is divided by 3. One when you sign, one when you give it in, and one when it's printed. So he was getting, or maybe he's even got, 18 million just for actually agreeing to do the book. But the company won't want bland information about how nice everybody is, and really he didn't have such a bad life. Nobody will want that. If they're paying that sort of money, they want all the dirt as well, don't they?
I mean, isn't this one of the frustrating things that people have? They went to America saying that they wanted to have an independent life, a quiet life, but, it's things like this book, it's things like the documentaries and all these talks that they're still effectively wanting to make money from their time as royals.
Yes, I think that's what's all wrong about it. And I don't think necessarily that Harry thought this would happen. But you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't have a royal title, expect to go to all the major events and parties and be highly up the ladder of who's who in the royal family, and then use that to earn a lot of money. I mean, he promised the Queen when they left in 2020 that he would not. He would honour that, because you can't have the palace behind, you know, the type of coffee you're having or the type of book you're doing, the type of programme. You have to stick to those rules. A lot of the rules are very sort of old-fashioned and not terribly important, but that one, I think, is a very important one, that you use all the opportunities you've had to then, and the life you've lived, to make a lot of money.
Yes, well, Angela, thank you for joining us. Angela Levin, the royal commentator and biographer. We were just showing those images of their wedding. When was it? I don't know, years ago.
May 2018.
May 2018. I mean, I wish we could go back to then, because things were nice and rosy, weren't they? And, you know, she was quite popular. Yeah.
You know, I think this idea that the overwhelming majority were hostile, even, you know, racist towards her, I'm not sure that's completely accurate. I thought that there was a lot of goodwill. A lot of people were really excited about the possibility of Meghan joining, and it is sad that it has.
I think people just wanted to see him happy. That was the main thing, because, you know, William had got married, and, you know, they had a tragic childhood because of what happened to their mother, and so people were really behind him and really genuinely happy for him. But it's turned sour, hasn't it? But anyway, let us know what you think. GBviews at gbnews.uk.
Well, in another story, a leading baby charity has exclusively told GB News that they're calling for mandatory third trimester scans for all mothers in a bid to prevent late loss and stillbirths.
Yes, well, the announcement comes during Baby Loss Awareness Week, and the charity, called Abigail's Footsteps, has also marked the week by releasing a short film aiming to break the taboo surrounding baby loss by asking people to say their baby's name.
Well, our reporter Ellie Costello went to meet a mother who lost her son, Jackson, in the late stages of pregnancy 2 years ago. She asked her how she remembers her late son.
I keep all these in my zip bags, so I don't want them to lose their smell.
Joanne Hanlon had a late miscarriage with her son Jackson in 2020. She was 6 months pregnant.
We actually struggled with fertility issues, so we was actually told that it would be a 1 in a million chance of us actually getting pregnant in the first place. So it was like a miracle baby. Yeah, we was over the moon.
Joanne had to give birth to baby Jackson in hospital.
I guess you don't think about having to give birth to a baby who's not alive when you're pregnant. And it's a really difficult thing, because part of you doesn't want to let them go. At the time, I just remember feeling like it was all my fault and I must have done something.
Well, estimates suggest that there are 250,000 miscarriages before 24 weeks in the UK each year. It's estimated that 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in miscarriage. Just over a year after Jackson's passing, Joanne gave birth to a happy and healthy baby boy, Theo.
This necklace has got one hoop for each child, and they've all got their birthstones on it, and that was a present for Christmas. And I like to do their handprints, and because one of the only things we've got of Jackson is his handprints and his footprints, so I like to do the kids' handprints and footprints so that he can still be included in things, because for us, he did exist.
Joanne says receiving counselling through a local charity, Abigail's Footsteps, helped her process her grief.
We lost Abigail back in 2009. She was 42 weeks gestation. The nursery was ready, the car seat was in the car. We were going to go into hospital, we were going to bring her home. And when we were told there was no heartbeat and, you know, we'd lost her, it was a tremendous shock.
Abigail's Footsteps charity are this week launching a new campaign for Baby Loss Awareness Week. It's called Say My Baby's Name.
Is this the room you were in before? Were you here with him?
It's okay. You can say my baby's name.
Were you here with Jordan?
Mum and Dad had that baby. That baby existed. Mum is a mum already. And please recognise that baby. Don't forget to say their name.
The charity is also calling for a mandatory third trimester scan for all mothers to try and prevent late loss and stillbirths.
And I'm hoping that we can push forward and make these things mandatory, that all mums can have a third scan. and that we don't lose babies at 40, 41, 42 weeks as we did with Abigail. It shouldn't happen.
We put this suggestion to the Department of Health and Social Care. They said maternity safety is a priority and we are making progress to meet our target to halve the rates of stillbirth, neonatal and maternal deaths by 2025. We have invested £127 million into maternity services across the country. And the NHS has developed guidance for clinicians to reduce the risk of baby loss and better monitor pregnancies. Joanne hopes that by speaking about her son Jackson on Baby Loss Awareness Week, she can help other women feel like they can get the support they need too.
When you're going through that, it's really nice to have a support network around you that understands what you're going through, and being able to reach out to other people that have been through it has definitely helped me in my grieving process.
Ellie Costello, GB News.
Thank you, Ellie Costello, for bringing us that really important report.
Yes, well, keep all your thoughts coming into us on our email, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We've got lots to read out in the next hour. We are here till midday as usual, but we're gonna take a short break and we will be back after that short break. But here's your weather first.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It was a chilly start for many in the south with a touch of frost in places. And it's a fine day for most, especially in the south where we keep the sunshine. But in the north, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to turn progressively more cloudy, more breezy, and there will be some rain later on ahead of these weather fronts that are moving in from the Atlantic. But high pressure across England and Wales brings mostly a fine day. The best of the sunny spells will be across East Anglia, the South Midlands, southern counties of England and South Wales. Further north, cloudier skies, 1 or 2 light showers for Cumbria into the Pennines. But more persistent rain will affect western Scotland along with a freshening breeze. And here, 12 or 13 Celsius will be the high in the afternoon, but further south, 15 or 16 Celsius possible where we get the sunny spells. But it's in the south and more especially the southeast where we keep the clear skies overnight. It will be once again a chilly night. But elsewhere, for much of the UK, thickening clouds and outbreaks of rain spilling into western Scotland, western parts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts, mainly over western hills, but that will keep it mild. Temperatures staying in the double figures. A breezy night to come as well, with the strongest winds around the Western Isles. And then that rain pushes through the rest of Scotland into northern England, parts of Wales, and by lunchtime it's reaching Cornwall as well. But it does turn more showery by this stage. It clears Scotland and Northern Ireland, where sunny spells replaces the rain, and highs of 13 or 14 Celsius. And it stays bright in East Anglia in the southeast. After a chilly start here, 17 degrees is likely by the end of the day. Now, the front becomes slow-moving as it crosses central parts of the UK. Some heavy showers in places, particularly northern England, North Midlands, and then later on into much of Wales and the southwest. That front disappears, but more unsettled weather is on the way for Thursday and Friday. It's also going to turn much more windy.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with Inaya Falarid Iman and myself, Mercy Muroki. We're on your TV, online and radio.
We're with you until midday, bringing you all of today's biggest stories and expert guests with our opinions as well as yours.
Yes, and you can get them in, your opinions, at GBViews at gbnews.uk, and we'll get to some of those throughout the programme. But here's the latest news first.
Good morning, it's 11 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank is now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk, and they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. The Chancellor is going to have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors he can get the public finances back under control. That's the analysis of a leading economic think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng is going to appear in the Commons today and face questions from MPs about his economic plans. The Labour Party are calling for Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng to reverse more of their decisions made on that mini-budget. The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, told GB News the government's strategy is wrong.
What the government's going to do now is announce a whole series of public spending cuts in this Halloween fiscal event at the end of the month. And, you know, this doesn't make sense to make one set of mistakes and then compound it by making the public pay for ministers' mistakes through cuts in public services. It'd be far better to pause this whole thing and revisit the mistakes that caused the market chaos in the first place.
The Prime Minister will urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in their support of Ukraine during crisis talks later. Liz Truss and her Ukrainian counterpart will join the virtual meeting of world leaders today. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. Further air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. Well, meanwhile, the UK's ambassador to the UN, Dame Barbara Woodward, last night repeated her calls for Russia to end the war.
Putin is trying to take Ukraine's land, its resources, its identity. In doing so, he is overturning the most sacred principle in the international system, that borders cannot be drawn by force.
Supreme Court judges are hearing arguments to determine if the Scottish Parliament can hold an independence referendum without the support of Westminster. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon declared she'd like to hold the vote in October next year. Well, 2 days have been set aside for the hearing. The UK government will respond tomorrow. The last vote was held in 2014 and 55% of the Scottish electorate rejected independence. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. Figures from the Office for National Statistics said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. There's also been a record rise in the number of people off work or not looking for work because of long-term sickness. The first of the funerals for the victims of the service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland are taking place today. Candlelit vigils have been held to remember the victims of the suspected gas explosion, which killed 10 people on Friday. Police believe the blast was an accident and they're investigating the cause. Heathrow's regained its status as Europe's busiest airport, despite struggling with staff shortages and imposing a daily passenger cap over the summer. The airport claims it's had a higher volume of travellers between July and September of this year, more than any of Europe's other busy terminals, like those in Paris and Amsterdam. However, demand at Heathrow last month was still 15% lower than before the pandemic. You're up to date now on GB News. I'll bring you any more developments as they happen. Now let's head back to the point.
Good morning. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Mercy Muroki, and Inaya Falarin Iman. We're on your TV, radio and online, and here's what's coming up for the final hour.
Well, Russia's continued aggression on Ukraine has called G7 leaders meeting this afternoon to discuss escalations and rising gas prices. This comes after a series of aerial strikes across Ukraine killed at least 19 people and left many more injured. We'll be joined by Ukrainian PM very shortly.
And Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng is set to answer questions in the Commons later today. But what can we expect after reversing his decision to abolish the 45p tax rate for higher earners and bringing forward his medium-term fiscal plan to the end of this month, Halloween? What is the future of the economy? We're going to be speaking to Liam Halligan, our business and economics editor, very shortly.
And in the wake of Just Stop Oil Extinction Rebellion and now the Royal Society of the Protection of Birds, who want to take direct action against the government's new growth policies, which could damage wildlife. So does direct action really work? We will be looking at that later on in the show.
Yes, and get in touch with your views, as usual, on our email, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll go to those very shortly, we promise. And by very shortly, I meant right now. So let's go to Faye. The SNP are not Scotland and do not speak for all of us in Scotland. This is in relation to Nicola Sturgeon seeking another Scottish referendum, and the Supreme Court are currently hearing arguments to basically decide whether Scotland can unilaterally basically hold a referendum without Westminster's consent. Lots of you making similar points. Robert says, who can blame the Scottish government wanting freedom from Westminster when half of England want the same?
Well, I think that is a good point. Well, on the Iranian protest, Caroline says, as the internet has grown rapidly around the world during the last 20 years, younger generations using this technology in oppressed societies are more exposed now than ever to new ways of thinking and ideas. And essentially, that could be one of the arguments as to why many of these things are spreading. And we saw that in relation to the Arab Spring in the early 2010s as well. So very good point there, Caroline.
Yes, now on to our top story for the hour. G7 leaders, including Liz Truss, will hold a video conference this afternoon to discuss the escalating war in Ukraine and resulting gas prices.
Well, this comes after Russia's aerial strikes across Ukraine, which killed at least 19 people and left many more injured. Vladimir Putin said the strikes were in retaliation for Ukraine's, quote, terrorist action against the Kerch Strait Bridge in Crimea, but Ukraine has rejected this claim of provocation.
Yes, well, Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to make the battlefield, quote, more painful for Russian troops and has said air defence was the #1 priority for the country.
Well, let's speak now to Ukrainian MP Alexei Goncharenko. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. I mean, what is the extent of the damage caused by Putin's attacks on Ukraine yesterday?
Hello. Yes, that was a difficult day, and that was the worst missile attack on our country from February 24. But you should understand that militarily it does not change anything, because military targets were not hit. All this was against civilian areas. This was an act of terror. So Putin tries to threaten Ukrainians, but this will not happen. We are not afraid of Putin. We showed it to the whole world. And from this point of view, this was absolutely useless attack for Putin, but also it was a huge criminal crime, war crime from Russia, because Kyiv children playground, Kyiv University, hospitals, and other absolutely civilian objects were hit by Russia.
And what more do you think that the UK and G7 leaders and other global powers should be doing or could be doing? Because There has been a lot by way of sanctions, by way of aid, especially military aid. Is there anything else that you think they possibly could do to halt Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine?
Yeah, sorry for being maybe straight, but just one question. How many more Ukrainian women and children should be killed before our allies will give us all weaponry we need? And we are ready to buy it. We're not asking it for granted, but to sell it to us. Yes, there is a lot of military aid, but we receive drones, but not fighters. We have not received any one fighter from our allies. We are receiving armored vehicles, but no one tank. We received no one Western tank from the beginning of invasion and before this also. That's good and that's great that we received HIMARSs and MLRS from United States, United Kingdom, but why only with short-range missiles? No one long-range missiles, and we haven't received them. So my ask is very simple. Give us every weaponry we need. Well, again, we are ready to buy it, so that's not about some we are asking. And we will finish this awful war. We will save our women and children. We will save the Europe from very hard winter and from inflation and all other consequences of this war. Because now we have unique window of opportunity. Russian forces are disorganized. Putin can't do anything with our army. That's why he attacked our civilians. But to finish everything, we need more weaponry, more powerful weaponry, and sure air defense. Unfortunately, with these, we have big problems still. And I hope during this meeting today of G7, and also Liz Truss said that she is initiating meeting of NATO leaders, this decision on weaponry supply finally will be made.
I mean, Alexei, do you worry that Western support for Ukraine may be waning? Are you still confident that support and morale for the struggle of the Ukrainian people is still high?
Yeah, morale of our people is very high. You can see video of people who are in shelters in tube, hiding from Russian missiles and singing Ukrainian anthem and national songs. So people are ready to fight and ready to stand. Yes, it is hard, but we will hold our positions because we believe in our victory, and that will be our common victory, victory of the free world.
And just tell us a bit about what's the morale of the people who are actually living and facing this day to day in Ukraine, because we talk a lot about strategy, about global responses, for instance, but of course we have to remember there are people who, for whom this is reality. This war is very much their day to day reality. From the people you speak to, what are they saying? What's their morale at this point?
For sure, people are concerned when missiles are falling on their heads. That is not something to be happy of. And also, Russia attacked energy infrastructure, and now part of Ukraine is without electricity, including part of big cities. Sure, it is difficult, but we are ready to pay this price because we know that other consequence is disastrous, because Putin just wants to wipe out Ukraine from the planet's map, and he is committing genocide against Ukrainians on occupied territories. So we need to fight, and we need to survive, and we need to win, and we understand it.
Well, thank you so much, Alexei Goncharenko, for joining us
Thank you.
On the programme. Ukrainian MP, thank you for that. I mean, it is, very, worrying that this war is still going on after several months, and it is coming up to a year. And, I do very much worry that Western support may well wane, but I would argue this is, a struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. And we should stay and maintain our resolve for the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I do also get the other side of the argument where people say, well, how long can we continue to support Ukraine, and how much, or when I say we, the West, wealthier nations in the West, how long can they continue? And there's a lot of people who see the numbers that we've contributed in the effort to defeat Vladimir Putin and say, hang on a minute, I'm not so comfortable with those sorts of figures being spent when we know what the state of the country is in. And I do think that is a legitimate argument for people to make. But there is also a bigger picture.
I completely agree with you, and I do worry that those that may not necessarily completely support our particular policy currently are being delegitimised and seen as, morally inferior for taking a different view, and that is not what we want to see. And I did read an interesting article which made a comparison with the way that those who criticise our position on lockdown, for example, were during the time of the lockdown were seen as morally inferior, and actually many of those things that they argued for did transpire. So we need to make sure that we maintain space for a public debate.
Well, let's read a couple of your views out. Right, where shall we begin? Linda, have we read Linda? She says, we don't want independence. People vote SNP to avoid Labour. In the past, when there was no chance of Tory success, we voted SNP. Nicola Sturgeon, according to Linda, is a disgrace of a leader with no accountability for her failings. In fact, devolution has failed drastically, and we are taxed higher here with none of the benefits of tax reforms being introduced.
Yeah, well, it is an argument that, whether or not there should be a Scottish Parliament at all. Now, there are a minority of Scots who do think that when devolution and the Scottish Parliament were introduced only a few decades ago, that's only really put Scotland on one-way trajectory towards independence. And actually, there is a party in Wales, Abolish the Welsh Assembly, who think that actually it is sovereign. Westminster should be sovereign. Well, it will be an ongoing debate, and we will be bringing you all of those updates from the Supreme Court case going on right now.
Yes, well, after the break, Parliament will return today with Chancellor Kwesi Kwarteng, who faces questions over his decision to abolish the 45p tax rate for high earners, and is also bringing forward his medium-term fiscal plan to 31st of October. He's going to be facing his MPs. Well, we'll be looking at that with our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan, next.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It was a chilly start for many in the south, with a touch of frost in places. And it's a fine day for most, especially in the south where we keep the sunshine. But in the north, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to turn progressively more cloudy, more breezy, and there will be some rain later on ahead of these weather fronts that are moving in from the Atlantic. But high pressure across England and Wales brings mostly a fine day. The best of the sunny spells will be across East Anglia, the South Midlands, southern counties of England and South Wales. Further north, cloudier skies, 1 or 2 light showers for Cumbria into the Pennines. But more persistent rain will affect western Scotland along with a freshening breeze. And here, 12 or 13 Celsius will be the high in the afternoon, but further south, 15 or 16 Celsius possible where we get the sunny spells. But it's in the south and more especially the southeast where we keep the clear skies overnight. It will be once again a chilly night. But elsewhere, for much of the UK, thickening clouds and outbreaks of rain spilling into western Scotland, western parts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts, mainly over western hills, but that will keep it mild. Temperatures staying in the double figures. A breezy night to come as well, with the strongest winds around the Western Isles. And then that rain pushes through the rest of Scotland into northern England, parts of Wales, and by lunchtime it's reaching Cornwall as well. But it does turn more showery by this stage. It clears Scotland and Northern Ireland, where sunny spells replaces the rain, and highs of 13 or 14 Celsius. And it stays bright in East Anglia in the southeast. After a chilly start here, 17 degrees is likely by the end of the day. Now, the front becomes slow-moving as it crosses central parts of the UK. Some heavy showers in places, particularly northern England, North Midlands, and then later on into much of Wales and the southwest. That front disappears, but more unsettled weather is on the way for Thursday and Friday. It's also going to turn much more windy.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 11:22 and this is To The Point with me, Mercy Muroki, and Inayat Falarin Iman on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio.
Yes, well, after a 2-week recess, Parliament will return today with Chancellor Kwarteng, who faces questions from both his own party and opposing MPs after his decision to abolish the 45p tax rate for higher earners and bring forward his medium-term fiscal plan.
Yes, well, the Chancellor recently announced that his debt-cutting plan will be published on the 31st of October on Halloween. That's despite claiming in an interview with our economics and business editor Liam Halligan that the plan would be published on November the 23rd.
You are going to bring forward the fiscal assessment in conjunction with the Office of Budget Responsibility. You said in your speech yesterday that will happen shortly. Is shortly before the 23rd?
So shortly is the 23rd. I mean, people reading the runes and parsing.
So it is going to be the 23rd of November. You're not bringing that fiscal
it's
plan
going to be
forward.
it's going to be the 23rd of November.
Okay. And now here to discuss this further is our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan. Are you surprised? Are you surprised that Kwasi changed his mind?
No, not really. He's under a lot of pressure from his own backbenchers and from financial markets. So, as you said in the introduction, that fiscal statement's now going to be the 31st of October, Halloween. Maybe an unfortunate date to choose in the calendar, given the angst that's out there. And we've seen more of that this morning. You know, we talk about gyrations on financial markets and they sound kind of arcane and otherworldly. But this stuff really affects how ordinary people borrow and arrange their finances. So, for instance, this morning, the Bank of England has been buying more bonds. What does that mean? The Bank of England is supporting the government's borrowing in the financial markets. The government sells its own debt. They're called gilts because they used to be gilt-edged in the old days with gold to suggest that they'd be paid back. And there's no question that the government won't pay back what it owes. The question is how much investors charge the government to lend money to the government, and that rate is going up. as there are more and more concerns swirling about whether or not the government, frankly, can make the sums add up. I personally think those concerns are wildly overstated, wildly overdone, but that doesn't mean that financial markets aren't sort of getting themselves in a bit of a tiz, and that's why the Bank of England this morning extended the amount of money that it's going to spend in those bond markets to try and keep a lid on those borrowing costs. But since that mini budget back on the 23rd of September, it seems like a long time now, average borrowing costs in the money markets, which then acts as a benchmark for mortgage rates, and personal loan rates tend to be slightly higher because they're not secured on a property. Those average rates have gone from like roughly 3.5% to now about 4.5%. So that's a big increase in just a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And those increases on those money markets, these bond sales that we talk about, they ripple out right across the economy and impact people who are servicing a mortgage. If their fixed rate is coming to an end, they've got to refix at a higher rate of interest, and people on variable rate mortgages, and some personal loans are variable rate as well. So this stuff, we try and explain it as well as we can. It does sound a little strange and on another planet to lots of people, but it really, really matters.
Yeah, and talk to us about what Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor's intention will be with this announcement, this fiscal plan he's unveiling on the 31st of October. Will it be to reassure the markets? Will it be to simultaneously reassure people who have investments like properties? What will be the purpose?
It will be a very political statement, but also quite a technical statement. So it will take lots of unpacking by journalists like us here on GB News. There'll be lots of politics in it because he'll be trying to convince his own backbenchers. Many Tory backbenchers didn't vote for Liz Truss, and Kwasi Kwarteng is Chancellor because Liz Truss is the Prime Minister. They're politically very, very, very close. So he'll be trying to convince his own backbenchers, the media, the public in general, that they have got a firm grip of the public finances. But related to that, they'll also be trying to prove to investors across the world who invest in UK government debt, which, by the way, is one of the highest rated and most respected forms of government debt investment in the world. So let's not overstate the panic here. They'll be trying to convince them that the interest rates that they're charging the government on that debt are simply too high, because they have got a plan to bring the public finances back into some sort of balance and restore some kind of order. It all hinges, Mercy, on this concept of growth, because if the government can convince everybody its policies are bold enough to get growth going, to make the pie bigger, to use a phrase that lots of people are using at the moment, then those fiscal numbers kind of take care of themselves. If you've got more going on in an economy, you raise more revenue, fewer people on benefits, job numbers stay very, very high and buoyant, unemployment stays very, very low, the government has to spend less. So it's all about restoring growth. And if Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss can convince all of us, particularly the financial markets, that their plan for growth, they're going for growth, it's really going to work, then I think in the end the markets will forgive them. But there's quite a long way, and there's a big perceptions gap at the moment between where we are now and where the government wants us to be.
And you mentioned growth, but what about spending cuts? I mean, the IFS have said that the Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than 60 billion if he is to meet the target to get public finances.
That's one scenario. That's one way. If they only relied on spending cuts to get the public finances back into some kind of balance that was seen to be what was correct before the mini budget. Another way would be to raise tax rates. Another way that blows tax rates and spending cuts out of the water is growth. Growth is the balm. It soothes all tensions because it just makes the pie bigger. There's more to go around. So you're right, the IFS have used that number, but that is just one scenario. If you only go down, if you put all your chips on one method of restoring the public finances. Another thing I'd say about the IFS, a very, very credible organisation. They're very good at looking at a particular tax move or a spending move and assessing how that will impact the public finances. They're less good, and they'd acknowledge this, at sort of macroeconomic forecasting, seeing the whole picture, seeing how growth interacts with currencies, interacts with international trade and so on. That's not really what they do. And the other thing I'd say is that in those IFS numbers, they're still assuming that the spending cap on energy, which is by far the most important thing the government's spending money on as per the mini budget. It could cost 100, 200 billion pounds if gas prices stay very, very high on international markets. To deliver that per unit cap will cost lots and lots of money. But if the gas price keeps coming down, and it has been coming down sharply over the last month, that's not really reflected in those IFS numbers, then the government will spend a lot less money on that energy price cap, and the public finances and the outlook for public spending will be much, much more healthy. So huge numbers of variables. I'm trying to explain them as clearly as I can, but, you know, the more you simplify it, you get to a point where you're not actually being realistic about the situation. It's a complex situation, but I would say this sort of market ferment has reared its ugly head quite quickly. It could just as easily quickly disappear.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us that very important and fascinating insight, Liam Halligan, our economics and business editor. Thank you.
Yes, and now we're going to take a short break, but after the break, we're going to ask whether direct action really works, because in the wake of various protests from groups like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, and now possibly even the Royal Society of the Protection of Birds, do these protests make a difference and get the message across, or do they do the opposite? But before that, a look at this morning's headlines.
Good morning. It is 11:30. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date today on GB News. The Bank of England have bought more government debt, having warned again there's a risk to the UK's financial stability. Initially forced to act to counter turmoil in the markets after the Chancellor's mini-budget, the bank is now expanding its bond buying in an effort, they say, to restore orderly market conditions. The bank warned that a sell-off of government bonds posed material risk, and they've said they've acted to prevent dysfunction in the debt market. The Chancellor will have to find spending cuts of more than £60 billion if he wants to convince investors he can get the public finances back under control. Well, that's the analysis of a leading economic think tank for the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Kwasi Kwarteng will appear in the Commons and face questions from MPs about his plans. The Prime Minister Liz Truss will urge G7 leaders to remain steadfast in their support of Ukraine during crisis talks this afternoon. It's after Russia launched its most significant attack on Ukraine in months. Missile strikes hit Kyiv and other cities, killing at least 19 people and injuring more than 100. More air raid sirens have been heard this morning in the capital amid warnings of further Russian missile attacks. The head of Britain's intelligence agency, GCHQ, says Ukraine is successfully turning the tide against Russian forces, despite recent attacks. In a speech later today, Sir Jeremy Fleming will say Russian gains are being reversed in a staggering cost to the Kremlin. The Supreme Court's been told it's in the public interest to resolve the issue of whether the Scottish Parliament can hold a referendum on independence without the support of Westminster. The Scottish Government are putting forward their case first. Well, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, says she wants to be able to hold an indisputably lawful vote. 2 days have been set aside for the hearing, with the UK Government expected to respond tomorrow. Unemployment in the UK has dropped to its lowest rate in over 50 years. The ONS said the rate fell to 3.5% over the 3 months to August. However, wages are failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. It's GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning. It's 11:35. This is To The Point with Inaya Falarin Iman and myself, Mercy Muroki, on GB News. We're live on your TV, online and radio this morning.
Yes, and we are going to go to some of your views and also some opinions. We'll chat about some of the things we've been talking about today. So, firstly, we have a view here from John, who says, if people are complaining about government borrowing, what are we going to do next? Borrow more to pay 10% rise in benefit claimants plus nurses as well as the rest of the public sector. What about the rest of us? We carry on paying taxes. I mean, that is a valid point and some of the frustration people are having in terms of the trade-offs in terms of spending and cuts. And we just want the government to be honest with people about what is really going to be cut to pay for things. So
Yes,
very important point.
Well, keep your views coming in, gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll go to a few more before the end of the show. But in the wake of Extinction Rebellion and just stop oil protests, I'm sure you would have seen the images of all of that or actually been directly affected by it if you're in one of our cities. They've caused disruption on roads and motorways, but does direct action actually work?
Well, more recently, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has said it has not ruled out direct action from defending nature from the government's key growth policies that could damage wildlife.
Yes, but where has this inspiration come from? Does protesting get the message across, or does it have the opposite effect? Well, joining us now is Rupert Reid, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia. He's also an author and former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Really appreciate your time this morning. Is there any evidence that direct action actually works in persuading the public, persuading the government of causes?
Well, yeah, the evidence is pretty straightforward. So if you look at history, the suffragettes, if you look at the civil rights movement in the US, Gandhi, Indian independence movement, they all used nonviolent direct action and they all won, and they are all now perceived as obviously legitimate and correct. If you look back at Extinction Rebellion, it's very clear that Extinction Rebellion got the issue of climate into people's consciousness and into the news in a way that had never happened before in the first rebellion in 2019. And if you look at the latest development here, the RSPB saying now that government policy is so extreme that they won't rule out taking nonviolent direct action. Well, I don't watch GB News all the time, but it is the first time I've heard the RSPB mentioned actually on GB News. So it seems that direct action does work even before you even do it in terms of getting the attention of the media. And I would say to the media, obviously the media, GB News, whoever, are going to be interested in direct action, but it's also very important to pay attention to the concerns of groups before they feel they have to resort to nonviolent direct action. It would have been great to have heard more about the RSPB's completely legitimate objections to this government's extreme policies against nature before they said they would be willing to undertake nonviolent direct action to stop it.
Well, Rupert, I mean, you mentioned, direct action in relation to the suffragettes and other important movements throughout history. But many people would say that Extinction Rebellion and many of these activists are not comparable to those movements, and is actually an insult to the genuine struggles for human dignity and respect that many of those other movements actually forwarded. In fact, some people would argue that Extinction Rebellion have a much more negative view of human beings. They prioritise nature and the environment over perhaps the economic prosperity, the development of the economic development of human beings. So in that sense, is it really right to make that kind of comparison? Because actually what it seems that this direct action only really frustrates the public and alienates them from your cause.
Well, there's a number of things there. Let's start with the point about prioritizing nature. Anyone who thinks that nature isn't very important, I'd invite them to see how long you can live while holding your breath and eating money. What the RSPB are saying here is that nature is under such threat that they, an incredibly moderate organization, are now being forced to consider nonviolent direct action. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because it works and because they're desperate. And when people are desperate, they will resort to these kinds of measures. Now, in terms of Extinction Rebellion, I'm not part of Extinction Rebellion anymore. I have no dog in this fight. But if we look back at history, as I say, then what is very clear is that whenever these movements come along, people always say, oh, you're extreme, you're going to alienate people. That is exactly what people said to the suffragettes, to the civil rights movement, and so forth. So, of course, it's no surprise that you and others are saying the exact same thing now against people like Extinction Rebellion. But what Extinction Rebellion are trying to do, it's worth trying to empathize with why people like Extinction Rebellion, or Just Stop Oil, or now the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, get driven to this kind of situation. The reason they get driven to it, as I say, is because they are desperate and because other avenues have not worked. And with Extinction Rebellion in 2019, it was very clear that it worked in the sense that public consciousness on climate and on nature changed permanently. And people in opinion polls after the rebellion said they didn't necessarily like XR very much. But what they said is, yes, we now understand how much of an emergency this is, how much of an existential threat.
You say the government is pursuing extreme policies and not listening to you. But I mean, for a lot of people, that is completely the opposite of what they've seen. I mean, we were at the top of the COP26. We had the climate secretary, Alok Sharma. He was crying and actually arguing more than perhaps any other country for strong action on net zero. So this idea that this country or the leadership historically have been behind or extreme doesn't really seem to be what has transpired the last few years.
Well, let's turn to why the RSPB are doing what they're doing. Why is this incredibly moderate organization now saying we're thinking of doing the same kind of thing as Extinction Rebellion did? It is because this government, which of course is unelected, it's got no manifesto legitimacy for what it's trying to do, is threatening to rip up all the fundamental protections that nature, including birds in this country, has. And that is why the RSPB and the National Trust and the Wildlife Trust, all these incredibly moderate organizations, are now absolutely furious because we have an extreme government with no legitimacy tearing these things up. Now, in turning specifically to climate, this government is saying that they're going to go even further than previous governments in ripping up the protections that we have. They're saying we're going to drill for oil all over the place. We're going to have fracking in this country, which if it happened, would devastate our country for no discernible benefit. And going back to the Boris Johnson government, I mean, that was already a really terrible government on these fronts, because although it's true that Boris Johnson and Alok Sharma talked a good talk, let's look at their walk. You have to look at what people actually do. And the Conservative government was already planning to start new coal mining in this country. Just let me finish, please. Was already planning to start new coal mining.
We do have to leave it
there,
unfortunately. We've given you plenty of time to make your case, and you would have convinced some people, maybe not others. But there you go. It was great talking to you, Rupert Reed, there, Associate Professor. I can't say that. Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of East Anglia, and author and former spokesman for Extinction Rebellion.
Yes, well, fascinating subject. I'm sure we will be revisiting that at some point. But in another story, a huge shortfall in parking spaces is forcing thousands of HGV drivers to sleep in unsafe conditions overnight. Fresh analysis into a government report by the PA news agency found that designated truck stops and motorway services lack the space for a fifth of the lorries and park overnight near major roads in England.
Well, it's just one of several issues plaguing the haulage industry, including fuel prices and a long-standing driver shortage. Well, with more on this, our East Midlands reporter Will Hollis joins us from a truck stop at junction 23 of the M1. Will, so just tell us what the issue is here. Is it that drivers are basically they don't have enough space, enough facilities to rest when they desperately need to rest when they're making these really long journeys?
Yes, completely their mercy. The drivers that drive HGVs, the majority of the goods that British people use, they spend a long day driving. They're out driving right now. That's why this car park, this HGV park is quite empty. But when they do get to a lot of these places, anything after about 7 o'clock, it's very rare that you'll be able to find a parking space. Just have a little bit of a look over here. There's 180 HGV parking spaces in this particular one on junction 23 in Loughborough, and this will fill up or get very much full most nights. This new Department for Transport study looks into the different regions and where there might be a bit of a problem where truck drivers can't find somewhere to stay. Here in the East Midlands, 92% of spaces at designated lorry parks like this are filling up. It's even worse in the east of England and in the southeast as well, particularly around the port of Felixstowe, where a lot of HGVs come in and out of. And that means that when drivers can't get into places like this, they end up on industrial estates or in lay-bys, where of course they're targets for criminal gangs, as well as potentially problems for people that live in residential areas. So a few moments ago I had a chance to speak to George, who's a HGV driver who was parked in here last night.
The lorry driver has to park in the industrial estate or lay-by on the tide road, which is not the most safe roads for sleeping overnight. It's not safe for you, it's not safe for your cargo. With the people which is looking to steal diesel from HGVs. And another thing is, if you are parked in the lay-by overnight, so many cars or lorries will pass you all the night. The cabin will still keep moving, and in the morning you will be tired, very tired. And the next day, I don't think you are too good to work a full day.
Yes, well, of course, not every driver wants to stay in parks like this. Some people do see a benefit to being outside, being able to make their own decisions. But of course, they don't have toilets there, they don't have showers, and they don't have security and CCTV. Of course, this was a Department for Transport study. A Department for Transport spokesperson says that we've taken unprecedented action to tackle the global HGV driver shortage, including investing over £52 million to improve roadside facilities and lorry parking. This funding is for improved eating and showering facilities, enhanced security and more parking spaces. Now, there has been a chronic shortage of HGV drivers, not only in this country, but across the world because of the COVID pandemic. Before that, though, there was also real difficulties in filling some of those spaces. And when you can't find a HGV parking space, when fuel prices are at some points astronomical, it's no wonder why people are deciding not to work in this industry anymore.
I will thank you for that update there. I hope that they do see the changes that they need from the government to make the conditions better. I always do feel so sorry for them because I've had periods where I drive a lot for whatever reason, especially when trains are on strike. So I end up driving much more than I usually would. And afterwards, my knees hurt. I'm 27. I'm not in terrible shape. But afterwards, my back hurts, my knees hurt. And I just think, these people who have, to drive as a job in these lorries and have to stay overnight sometimes without showers, without facilities, it is a really gruelling job, I think. Some people think, oh, you're just sitting down for 12 hours. We'd all love to do that. But it's actually a gruelling work, I think.
And it is interesting because HGV drivers were in the news earlier this year in relation to shortages, the discussions over Brexit. And it does seem when it's politically expedient, then HGV drivers are in the public attention and the discussion. But actually, when it's something that would hopefully improve their conditions, their paying conditions, it's not so much a priority. So hopefully that can be sorted.
Yes, well, now the cost of living crisis has had far-reaching effects as people try to reduce their spend and cut back on life's luxuries.
But the new figures reveal the rising cost of funerals is forcing many to borrow money to give their loved ones a good send-off. And in many cases, people are having to abandon the idea of a funeral altogether.
Yes, well, our South West of England reporter, Jeff Moody, has been to meet a funeral director who is concerned about the rising cost of dying.
The polished hearses, the fresh flowers, the coffin. The way we say goodbye doesn't come cheap, and when you throw in rising energy and fuel prices, the cost of dying is the highest it's ever been. Michael Peace is part of a family firm of undertakers in Hampshire that has been providing services to the community for over 60 years.
On our premises here, we've got a number of refrigeration units that we have to run continuously to look after deceased in the appropriate and the best manner, and so those costs are going up. And of course, we have to sometimes pass those things on to the client.
The average price of a funeral has now tipped £4,000, but in a new report from Sun Life, 1 in 5 say they are shocked at how expensive a funeral is. A third of people haven't saved enough for their own funeral, and many are now taking out loans or opting for a no-frills cremation, without fuss, without ceremony, without mourners.
And for example, the crematorium here locally may do what's called a direct cremation service, so that keeps the cost to a minimum as well. I think that they're an extremely good option for people who are concerned about what they're spending on funerals, but are able to do it in a dignified and professional way.
But there is a concern. Funerals are part of the whole grieving process, from the cars to the flowers to the coffin. And the worry is, if you dispense with too much of that, you're not grieving properly and you're storing up trouble for the future.
But obviously one of the challenges, and I think we saw this quite clearly with the Queen's funeral recently, is there is a desire on the part of lots of people to say farewell or pay their respects in person. And actually that can be quite helpful for the grieving process. So it's very definitely not a choice for everyone.
So says the National Association of Funeral Directors. But there's help at hand. The funeral expenses payment is a one-off means-tested payment designed to support people on benefits. In recent years, protest group Fair Funerals has been urging the government to step in and help further, ensuring everyone has the chance of a dignified farewell.
Don't wait until you're grieving to start thinking and talking to your family about funeral costs, because the fact is that when we are grieving, we're not able to act very often as savvy consumers. So unfortunately, we can end up spending more than we can afford on funerals.
Debt and rising costs are a huge part of our lives at the moment. The hope is those debts don't become a part of our deaths too. Jeff Moody, GB News.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that very important report. Well, in a different tone, schools will be encouraged to accommodate transgender pupils in, quote, common sense guidance, which will look at gender-neutral changing rooms and lavatories, but also allowing trans children to wear uniforms of their choice.
Yes, well, the Department for Education is enlisting the help of the Equality and Human Rights Commission and senior doctors to create an evidence-based guide that will allow head teachers to accommodate trans pupils.
Well, joining us now is human rights expert and LGBT campaigner Peter Tatchell. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. I mean, some people will say that actually, question even the idea of a transgender child, that there's children that may have gender dysphoria and they need support, but actually kind of putting a label on a child that's not an adult of transgender could actually be encouraging them down a particular direction. What do you think?
Well, of course, the number one priority is to listen to children themselves. And trans children are very clear in their identity, how they feel about who they are. So we should always listen to children. No one is encouraging trans children to be trans. No one's pressuring them to be trans, but organisations that exist do seek to support those who do believe they are trans. And we know that trans identity is a material reality. There's been research which shows that trans people have different brains, different parts of brain structure and processes from non-trans people.
You think that's still up for debate?
This is a biological material basis for trans identity.
I do think the point about trans children and trans people having different brain structures and things is still an ongoing medical kind of scientific debate. So I would just put the different perspective forward there. But some people would say that actually that we may be having a problem with social contagion. Actually, there's been an exponential rise in the number of children presenting as gender distress, and therefore schools effectively facilitating that by allowing gender-neutral uniforms and so on and so forth could actually be crystallising something that we're still yet to very much investigate.
Well, that's exactly what people said about gay people in the 1970s and 80s. They said, how come there's all these people suddenly declaring that they're gay? They never used to exist before. They're a tiny, insignificant minority.
I
now they're
think
everywhere.
that's unfair to say that that is the same thing. You know, there's people from across the political spectrum, from the scientific community, that are raising questions about the exponential rise in gender dysphoria, and we've even seen an increase in detransitioners. So I think it's not fair to compare it to what happened to gay people in the 1980s and so on.
Well, I lived through that, so I know better than you or anybody else exactly what was done and said.
There's also older gay people that disagree with your view, Peter.
Well, the vast majority of medical, scientific and human rights organisations stand with trans people and support them in their identity and oppose any kind of discrimination or demonisation. And this whole argument, this whole issue is being used as a political football, exploiting a vulnerable minority to score political points. Now, I think that's reprehensible. We need to recognise that trans people have a tough life, and we need to do everything in our power to make it easier for them, to show them love, kindness and support, not to demonise them or suggest they're somehow predators or a threat, which is nonsense.
I think everybody agrees that minorities should not be demonised or discriminated against. I just think that there's disagreements in terms of the approach to respond to this particular question that we're discussing. But thank you so much, Peter Tatchell, for joining us on the programme, human rights activist and LGBT campaigner. Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed that. I always enjoy you and Peter. Kind of sit back and really good civil discussion. That is it from us here at To The Point, but don't go away because up next is GB News Day with Mark and Gloria, and we're going to be back tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. But first, here's the weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It was a chilly start for many in the south with a touch of frost in places. And it's a fine day for most, especially in the south where we keep the sunshine. But in the north, for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's going to turn progressively more cloudy, more breezy, and there will be some rain later on ahead of these weather fronts that are moving in from the Atlantic. But high pressure across England and Wales brings mostly a fine day. The best of the sunny spells will be across East Anglia, the South Midlands, southern counties of England and South Wales. Further north, cloudier skies, 1 or 2 light showers for Cumbria into the Pennines. But more persistent rain will affect western Scotland along with a freshening breeze. And here, 12 or 13 Celsius will be the high in the afternoon, but further south, 15 or 16 Celsius possible where we get the sunny spells. But it's in the south and more especially the southeast where we keep the clear skies overnight. It will be once again a chilly night. But elsewhere, for much of the UK, thickening clouds and outbreaks of rain spilling into western Scotland, western parts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Some heavy bursts, mainly over western hills, but that will keep it mild, temperatures staying in the double figures. A breezy night to come as well, with the strongest winds around the Western Isles. And then that rain pushes through the rest of Scotland into northern England, parts of Wales, and by lunchtime it's reaching Cornwall as well. But it does turn more showery by this stage. It clears Scotland and Northern Ireland, where sunny spells replaces the rain, and highs of 13 or 14 Celsius. And it stays bright in East Anglia in the southeast. After a chilly start here, 17 degrees is likely by the end of the day. Now, the front becomes slow-moving as it crosses central parts of the UK. Some heavy showers in places, particularly Northern England, North Midlands, and then later on into much of Wales and the southwest. That front disappears, but more unsettled weather is on the way for Thursday and Friday. It's also going to turn much more windy.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.